Welcome you to this lunchtime talk, which I've been looking forward to for months. I have to tell you boring things first. Mobile phones off, I think, or silent. It's fine, we're not in a plane. And we're filming and live streaming, so if you're not supposed to be here, wear a hat. Welcome to everybody tuning in online. And remember that the hashtag is hashtag RSA 1%, spelt out. Okay, if you want to get involved in Twitter. Wow, that's atmospheric. Should we have a rave afterwards? Now, housekeeping over. It's my great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's special guest speaker. Danny Dorling is the Halford Mackinder. I don't know how to spell that. Pronounce that. Professor at Oxford. He's so prolific that a colleague of mine went to interview him once and made the mistake of printing out his CV, and it was 83 pages long. And she was quite young, so everybody was shouting at her, "Dawn, get off the printer!" He really is a colossus in the world of equality. I know we're not supposed to say that about equality, but it's true. And his new book, coming so hot on the heels of All That Is Solid, a wonderful book about housing, is Can We Afford the Super Rich? I can ruin the punchline and say, no, we can't. But let's let him tell us why not.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm going to force Zoe later on to explain that she was partly late because it involved Russell Brand and the police in Newham this morning, which is probably a more exciting story than the story I'm going to tell you. The one really good thing about studying inequality is it stops you feeling bad about your own position at all in society. It can actually make you feel fairly happy because you realise where you are and what's happening, and then it becomes as a surprise to you just how few people realise what the income and wealth distribution is in this country, what it's normal to have, what you have to fall into various groups. So I'm going to explain a bit of that to you, and I make no apology because I've just spent 2 days in London, and for a large amount of the last 2 days I've been talking to people about this book, about inequality and the 1%, telling them where the thresholds are, and then often the instant reaction from the kind of people I've been meeting is, oh no, that's not enough to get you in the 1%, surely you need more than that to be rich, because of the kind of people you get to meet and who has power, who's involved in publishing and the media, and so on. There is a perception that more people have more and it's normal to have a lot. And if we can do anything, it would be useful to begin to alter that perception. I only have one slide, so you have plenty of time to get used to this slide. This is the group right at the very top. There is more inequality within the 1%, the best off 1% in Britain, than there is within the other 99%. And that, I think, is quite important. What you're seeing here is a map of the country where area has been sized to make each region proportional to the wealth of the super rich, the 1,000 richest families that the Sunday Times very kindly documents each year and then tells us in glorious detail about, including write-ups about how wonderful some of them are. So I buy the Sunday Times meticulously once a year to get this. What I've also done is to highlight the 24 richest families in the country. There is one in each region, including one in the Channel Islands, and there are 10 in London. And in London, those little circles have them sized by the size of their wealth. And what you can see immediately, the bulk of the super rich in this country live in London, but for all of them living in London, the richest 10 families are taking a third of all the wealth. So it's not that hard if you're a member of the super rich not to feel that you're taking an enormous amount, because you can look up at those 10 families and say, well, my millions are fairly modest compared to the millions above me. I couldn't possibly afford to buy a house on Bishop's Avenue or wherever. And this may sound a bit flippant, but this is the kind of story you get all the way down throughout the 1% and a little bit beneath. I'm not that well off. The people above me are much better off. I have enough just to be able to get by, It is hard to be able to buy a house and so on. I have expenses, I have to pay for schools and the like. Why are you wanting me to have less? As a country becomes more unequal, as the divisions widen and as it steepens up amongst the very top, the cost of being in the very top rises. It does actually become much harder to get into the 1% and harder to hold yourself in there. I didn't pick the 1% simply because the Occupy movement picked the 1%, although they were remarkably apposite. If the book was properly titled, it would probably be something like Inequality in the 1.27%, but that, I don't think Leo, my publisher, would have allowed that. Last year, I published an article in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society looking at income changes amongst different groups in society, the 0.01, the 0.1, the 1%, the 10%, and so on. And the very interesting thing that has happened since 2008 is that a new cleavage has emerged between the 1% and those beneath them. The incomes, and certainly the wealth, but the incomes of the 1%, including people at the bottom of the 1%, have been rising since 2008. There was a small blip, but then it came up. In spring this year, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, who are remarkably good at this, HMRC released figures in spring showing that the 1% had had their biggest ever, I think, increase in income. They're remarkably good because they publish these figures just before the end of the tax year, so I'm not quite sure how they know, but HMRC actually now estimate people's incomes and send tax demands based on what they think you're going to earn, so they're quick. The 1% have been getting richer and richer more quickly very recently, and you'll know that average standards of living and average wages have gone down since 2008, particularly at the bottom, and benefit changes mean that people at the bottom are going to sink down even further. The Institute of Fiscal Studies published a report last year showing that for 99% of us, income inequality since the Great Crash has reduced so that the Gini coefficient of inequality is now back to what it was in 1990. So we are more in it together, except for the 1%. And it's no good being all in it together if you do have 1% moving off. At this point, you're probably wondering, am I in the 1%? What is the 1%? What's the qualifying level to be in the 1%? I won't. It'll be lovely if we had kind of little calculators linked to the screen. You could all type in a figure and we could actually see what the range was. For the book, I wanted to produce one of those kind of height-weight charts. Do you know the ones? I know the ones far too well. You look up your height, you look up your weight, there's these curves, and you can work out whether you're overweight or obese yet. And some of us are on that kind of curve. I wanted to try to do that with income and wealth, because if you know somebody's income and their wealth, you can do a curve. Our wealth statistics are simply too poor to be able to do that. But if you've got spare surplus money, that is money you can realise, you could easily downsize from a house or so on, or you own more than one property, of about $1 million in your household, you're in the 1% by wealth. By income, the cut-off point to get in the 1% is a gross income before tax of $160,000 for your household if there are 2 of you and you have no kids. So it's 160. I won't ask anybody to put their hands up, but there will be people here who are in the 1%. Most of you, even in this audience, and this audience, of course, is very likely to be majority 10%. Most of you will not be in that. So 160,000 before tax household income if there's 2 of you, no kids. Kids, you're looking at about £220,000 because of expenses that comes with kids. And families with kids tend to have a bit more. If you're single, you can get in the 1% with £100,000. I talked to a journalist earlier this week from the Evening Standard about these things, and he kind of got the wrong end of the stick. And so if you read the Evening Standard a couple of days ago, you'll see an article about what you need to do to get into the 1%. Because I was spending so long trying to explain what the thresholds were, that he thought this book is a kind of advice book about how to get there. And he didn't kind of get the idea, and it's amazing how many people don't get the idea that not only can you not all get in the 1%, but in fact, never more than 1% of people can get in the 1%. No matter how much advice we give you, it's not possible. It's not possible to do. But I did think that the way that article was written was indicative of one of the problems of gross inequality, in that we begin to get a society which begins to try to address these problems by saying to people, well, this is what you need to try to get up there. Your only chance is to get up. And we kind of dumb ourselves down in a way. The 1% are taking each year now about 15% of all income. I get 15% by adding in a little bit of estimates of tax dodging. So if you look at the Paris top incomes data set, they say 14. I think it's 15%. You have to go back to the early 1930s to find the 1% taking this much before. It's a huge amount of money. I ought to have stacked up. You know, you can have the NHS for that every year. You can add on the rest of the public services you can have for that. There is nowhere else you can go in Europe to find the 1% taking as much. We are the dunce of Europe. We are the most unequal country in Europe by far. We have median household incomes in this country which are slightly lower than those in France and in Germany. But in France and Germany, they all do better because they share out far more and their 1% takes far less. If you want a nearby country that's doing very well, it's the Netherlands. The 1% in the Netherlands take just under 7% of all income. A better example in a way, or a country that in some ways is more like us because they have lots of bankers, is Switzerland. And in Switzerland, the 1% are taking about half as much as our 1%. Swiss bankers get salaries which are half as much as our bankers. And I don't think they do a worse job at banking in Switzerland. Banking really matters, increasingly matters in the 1%. The 1% used to be a more diverse set of people, but many of the professions that used to just about tip into the 1%, this would be head teachers of very large schools, it would be doctors or surgeons doing very well, they've just about dropped out. There are hardly any GPs in the 1%, and there are about 200. Almost all of the GPs that are in the 1% have interests on the side. I think there are almost no head teachers that are in the 1%. It's increasingly full of financiers and managers. I think partly managers because, you know, if you're employing financiers so much, you know, you don't want to be paying people less than you're getting. And just to reiterate some statistics which are quite old but worth looking at, the European Commission now surveys salaries in banks. We don't. You have to go to Europe to actually find out about incomes at the top. We have over 2,200 bankers in this country, which are all almost in this city, paid over €1 million a year. The next highest country after our 2,200 is Germany, which has a larger population. Germany has 197. The rest of Europe simply does not pay people at the top this much. If you go to one bank, I don't feel bad about talking about this bank because it's the bank I joined as a student because they paid me £10 when I was 18. I feel, you know, I've donated enough from my current account to them. But if you go to Barclays, you'll see Barclays has over 300 members of staff, paid over $1 million. If you look at the whole of Japan, a country with twice our population, and you look across all of finance and industry in Japan, you will not find 300 people paid over $1 million. It's remarkably different. Why do we do it? Because we're so closely connected to the USA, where these kind of salaries in New York are seen as not being unreasonable, and because so many of our bankers move, well, they don't move that fast back and forward, to be honest, but they do often have had a job there and a job back again. there really is a problem of perception about these things, because you begin to get people working in finance and living in London in the cities that see very high incomes as being particularly low incomes. And while you have that kind of mentality, it becomes very hard to actually argue for change, to get things to change, because people say they can't possibly manage on less. If you say you want to do something sensible, such as extend the council tax system to make it a bit more progressive, you immediately have people shouting you down, saying that their £2 million house is a modest house and they couldn't possibly afford to pay slightly more tax on it because they say their circumstances are straightened. It's a stupid idea to call it a mansion tax. You should never have called it a mansion tax. But just extending council tax bands up, as Wales has done, should be possible. But the resistance to it comes because we've become so used to these gross inequalities. And they're altering the way we behave. They alter what we think is good, what we tell people to do. If you look at what students are now going to do in university, increasing numbers are heading towards finance and management and economics and law, because these are part of the very few numbers of professions that give you a chance of working your own way into the 1%. People are now being told to aspire to be in a very wealthy group. Not to aspire to be in the most useful 1%, but to aspire to be in the best paid 1%. And it is extremely expensive and inefficient. It mucks up all kinds of things. It mucks up your education system. You end up with the most divided education system in Europe, and you end up with escalating school fees in the private sector. Average school fees are now 4.5 times as paid for the average child in the private sector as opposed to the state sector. And the more the 1% get, the higher the cost that rises, and then that adds to the kind of problems that people in the bottom of the 1% talk about having. They become separated from the rest of society. But they're the kind of people that you see if you're watching TV and somebody's discussing the newspapers. And it's well worth, my favourite thing on the news is when they discuss the newspapers, because people have to talk about the newspapers and everyday stories, hiding their own personal positions. Almost always the people who are pundits on this thing do not use state services, do not have the same kind of issues that the majority of society have got, but they've learnt, at least if they're in the media, how to hide the fact. But their interests and their wishes are increasingly different. When you pay your taxes, what are you paying for? The only thing you're getting are the bins being emptied. Everything else, once you're into the middle of the 1%, you're paying for yourself, and you begin to resent paying for the rest. A third of all income tax is now paid by the 1% because the 1% takes so much. In a more normal country, you have a much more even distribution of income and earnings, and the 1% contribute far less to income tax because they have far less to contribute and everybody else has more, so they can all contribute more fairly. I'll just end up with 2 minutes about what you could do about it, and then we'll have a chat. But I want to reiterate this. Nothing is going